All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lucas, and I'm one of the project team leads here at Omnitus. And today we're going to talk a bit about what we call OmniCloud, or more specifically, all the different kinds of cloud file storage solutions. There are quite a few of them out there, things like OneDrive, we have Dropbox, we have the Microsoft versions like OneDrive. But no matter which one you use, the entire webinar today will be applicable to yours as well. We're going to be doing it in Google Drive, but everything will work the same no matter which service you're using. All right, so let's get into it. First off, we're gonna talk a bit about the general challenges that you might have using one of these cloud storage file systems. Common ones are going to be things like having a folder hierarchy. What I mean by that is, depending on what type of setup you might have a, for example, first like a region specific folder, and then you have clients folders within those, and within those you might have projects folders, etc. Now, setting up a hierarchy that makes sense isn't necessarily all that difficult. Having everyone follow those hierarchies is a whole nother story. And this also comes down to a bit of our second point here, an issue, which is often access control. What I mean by that as well is, once you have these hierarchies, it might be difficult to figure out exactly who should have access to what. So this often controls exactly what hierarchy you're going to have. But depending on how people are following this is when you usually run into trouble with that access control. Classic examples might be someone creates a client-specific folder in their own space, make it so that no one else has access to this folder. Or things like you might put sales files into the project folder where the salespeople suddenly don't have access, things like that, which goes into the final point, which is visibility. The right people having visibility of the correct folders, the correct files, so that they can actually do their job. And we're going to take this one even one step further when we're talking about Monday.com, since in our example, which we'll get to in a minute, we have both our sales and projects within Monday.com. So when I work on a specific client or a specific project, and I need to find this folder, having to click down through all of these. Sorry, I'll go ahead. Thanks for letting me know as well. I just noticed that the screen wasn't sharing. So let's do that. We'll put that up again. Cool. So finally then, within Monday.com, what we're going to be looking into as well is how can we make the visibility even better? What I mean by that is, if we're working on our projects within Monday.com, we want a simple way to find these folders without actually needing to deep dive through all of these hierarchies, finding the correct region, the correct client, the correct project folder, etc. We just want to quite quickly go into it, right? Okay, so moving on then, talking a bit more about how this is done from a technical standpoint. Really, these three steps are what it's going to come down to every time when we want to make a more dynamic solution. And what I mean by that, we want to avoid things like creating a folder in the incorrect hierarchy space. We want to avoid creating duplicate folders. If we already have, for example, a client folder, we don't want another one, so we suddenly have all of our files split. Next step, we're going to do some form of create. Once we've identified what we need, we're going to go ahead and create it. And then going back to that visibility step in connection with Monday.com, we're also going to save some things like navigation links so we can quicker find our way back to these folders down the line. All right. So this is what we're going to be looking at today. This is an example folder structure that we're going to be using. In our hierarchy, we're going to first have a client-specific folder, which is going to be the same name as our client, so it's also easier to search for. Of course, you can have a lot of more structures to the left of this, whether that be department-specific, region-specific. And then moving down the line, we're going to have a set of client folders again. And then for each client folder, we're going to have two main automatically generated folders. One is going to be a sales folder where we store all of our sales related files, things like quoting documents, pitch decks, etc. And then we're also going to have a project specific folder where we're within that folder as well, rather than having one project folder that store all the files for all of our different projects with that client. we're going to have another level for the project teams where we have one specific folder per project. And this is also going to be automatically created, and everything is going to land in the proper level so that we don't have to manually go in to our shared file storage and create this manually every time. Going back to that, we've set our hierarchy. This is how it's going to look, rather than everyone getting the responsibility of always creating files and folders in the correct space, making sure we avoid duplicates, etc. We're going to let the system do the work for us instead, so that, well, for one, you don't even have to go into the shared file storage to create these, but also since the system is based on logic, it's not going to make the same kind of human errors. Great. So let's jump into Monday. And as always, feel free to post any questions you might have along the way. But jumping into Monday, we're going to have first a quick run through of the demo setup that we have here. We have a very, very basic demo setup for the purposes of showing the functionality today. But here we have some form of CRM sales board. We have a couple of groups to move these opportunities throughout our sales. We get the leads first. We have some form of process that ultimately ends up being either a won or a lost opportunity, right? We're also gonna look at the projects aspect of it. So once the sales process has concluded, we're gonna start working on our project. We obviously have a separate space for that, right? We have some form of PMO. And within this space, we're also working with a similar process. We have not started project, active ones, and completed. Again, very simplistic, but to show you the idea behind it. And then finally, we also have, in this case, a client registry. The reason why the client registry by itself is very important is because in order to support our hierarchy, where really the central piece in our demo is the client folder, right? The client folder should be owned by the client within Monday as well. What I mean by that is, for example, let's say if we go to the CRM where we have our different prospects, if the client file were to be owned by one of these, then we would get duplicate files, right? Because if we have two opportunities with the same company, we would end up with two folders. But I'll explain further down the line why this is so useful as well within a full integrated system. All right, so let's start off with the first example then. In this case, we have a new client here. We have the client make.com that we've just started the process for. And at this point, we've created the client in our client registry. We've connected that client to this opportunity, and we want to create our folder. For those of you who have been working in Monday.com before, you might recognize this green line towards the top. What this means is that these are mirrored columns, meaning that this specific column here, the create client folder, we're not going to click on in a second, isn't technically within this board. This is the status column within the client registry, right? Again, the client registry is what's going to own the folder, and with it, the creation. And why that is useful is, for example, let's say I have another make.com opportunity further down the line. When I select that client, it's going to show the same value, which we'll see here in a second when I click create here. So if you go ahead and create, we can see that we also see that on any other opportunity, which is going to significantly lower the risk of accidentally creating more than one folder for the same client, right? So we'll give that one a second, and it's going to go ahead and create the folder, which is this integration right here. We'll get to that in a minute for those of you who want to have a quick look at how this looks in Make. But jumping back to Monday here, we can see that the status has changed to created to give us some user feedback. And we've also received a link right here. And this link, of course, if I click on it, it's going to open our specific shared file storage, in this case, Google Drive. And it's going to take me into the folder make.com, which again was the name of the client. You can also see if I jump back here one level up, here we have our clients folder, and we have 3 clients, as we could also see previously in the CRM. We also had a client folder created for Monday.com and Omnitas Consulting. So jumping back into the make.com folder here, we also have another step that we're going to do. Jumping back here to our folder structure, we also have a set of templates. So what the idea of these templates is that for most companies and most purposes, we're going to have some set of document templates that we're going to have use for in most both sales and projects. So what we've done here to make that also very easy to update and control is if I jump back here to the top level, I have a folder called template documents. So in this case, in our example, we have 3 sets of templates. We have our sales templates, going to be the same for every single sales process that we have. And then further down the line, which we'll get to, we'll also have 2 different type of template selections depending on the size of our project. So let's say, as an example here, we have this small project. It might only require a basic slideshow of the product presentation and a scope template, but that's all we need for those small projects. And then for the medium and large projects, we need a little bit more. We're going to do some stakeholder mapping and also a risk assessment matrix because of the size of that project. But for this one that we just generated, we also have a couple of sales templates, some product collateral, quote template, margin calculation sheet, and a pitch deck. And if I go back here, so I don't have to navigate all around again, let's go to the client folder that we just created, jump into the sales folder, and here we will find those templates as well. So when these folders are created, they essentially copy all of those template documents into the newly created folder so that we have copies or versions of it for this specific client. We can then go into these ones and start editing it to better fit that specific client. Great. So let's say here in our CRM, we worked on a client, we got all the way to 1, we closed the deal. We're gonna move on to actually starting our first project. Okay, so jumping into the project management system, and let's first off say that we didn't have all of these fancy functions that would create the folders for us. In this case, we would have to go into our shared file storage, we have to find the client, we possibly have to create a new projects map, create a new folder for that project as well, and then copy over those templates. A lot of unnecessary manual tasks. In this case, of course, we're going to start our project. We're simply just going to create that project-specific folder. Cool. In this case, we've also implemented an additional check since before, as we mentioned, we have 2 different set of templates that we want to put into these folders that we're just going to create, but those are based on the type of the project. So since I hadn't selected the type here, we're going to do some user feedback instead of just it stopping and the user has no idea. In this case, let's go with the medium project. Then we're simply going to try again. So we also get some validation into this. Again, one of the biggest risks of getting a messy shared file storage is that we don't have these controls. So having the system create them, we can also put in, these are all the values you need to fill in so that we can better create those for you. Fantastic. And there we have the project folder as well. Okay, so jumping into the projects folder here, we see obviously we have slightly different template documents compared to the sales process. And these were the ones that we looked at a while ago when we looked at the medium and large templates. In this case, we also have the same templates for medium and large. So just to show you as well that there can be some additional complexity to that as well when utilizing Make. In this case, we have a check for whether it's either medium or large projects. We're going to utilize the same templates, but it could also be more advanced selections than that. We might have things like we need different languages depending on the client. So we have language specific templates or region specific, which could be things like currency or prices, whatever it might be. So we have a lot of options here for exactly how we want to tweak these and really work with the workflow. Great. Another piece that you might have noticed as well here is that within the project, we also have this link to the client folder. And again, this is why it's so important that when you're within your Monday.com setup, you also have that hierarchy reflected the same way we have a client folder with a sales and projects folder. We have a client registry and specific CRM and PMO setups so that the workflow matches our hierarchy. What that means is with any time within the system, and it can be related to any boards not visible right here, whether we have some form of, let's say, support functionality, as long as you have a connection to that client through this connect column, we have access to the client specific folder as well through mirror columns. So this basically means that whenever I'm throughout the system building new things, as soon as we add in a connection to the client, we can have that navigation as well within that piece of the system and not have to build specific pieces for every setup. Cool. Any questions before perhaps taking a quick look at how this could look in Make? All right. Feel free to have a think about the questions, and let's jump into Make and have a look. Let's move this over here. Okay, so first step within the CRM, we created a client-specific folder. Within this workflow, or the example of this workflow, we assume that the CRM is always going to be the starting point. We're also always going to have a sales process before a project. So in this case, when you create the client folder, you create both the client folder and the sales folder at the same time. So look, jumping into Make, this is how it might look. And right here, we also see our specific execution. So let's do this just to get a clean space. All right, so within Make, for those of you who haven't seen Make before, it's essentially a logic flowchart. It goes left to right with a single signal. And this specific flowchart starts off when we click that button back in Monday, when we click Create. When we click Create, it's going to send a signal to Make, which is then going to go through and do all of these things for us the same way every time. It's going to fetch some more information for us. It's also going to do right here a check to see, is that folder already created? If it's already been created, it might be the case that someone accidentally removed this link or something like that. Let's actually do that just to show you the principle. But if you accidentally remove the link, you click Create, we don't want to recreate the same folder. So right there, you can see it was quite quick. That's because it went this path. So if I open this up again, we can see that we still only have that one Make folder within our clients. It didn't recreate a duplicate. It first checked, do we already have this folder? And then if we do, it just restores that link for us in case it was deleted. But let's say we haven't created it yet. It's going to move the upper path. And here we see some yellow modules for Google Drive. And step by step here, it's going to go through and first create that client folder. And then it's going to create the sales folder within the client folder that we just created. And the same thing with the projects. Finally, it's going to go over here and it's going to list our templates. And for each template, it's going to copy over that sales file to the corresponding folder. And then finally, of course, save that link back to Monday. Cool. See, we got some questions here as well. Can the client name be added to the copied document coming from the templates? Yes, it can. So let's actually jump into that specific one to show you how simple this would be. So within Make here, it's mostly going to be drop-down based or form-based. So in this specific one, it's asking me to say, which is the original file ID? If I hold my mouse over here, we're going to see the previous module pulsating, and that's the templates. So it's going to say, read this file, put it in this folder that we created previously. We can see over to the left, number 14 is blinking. And then to answer your question, the final piece of input is we're going to put the name of our created file as well. In here, we can type anything else. So in this case, I've dynamically mapped the same name as our templates, but in here, we could also pull in other pieces of information like the name of the client and such to make those folders even more searchable within our shared file storage. And another question, can I forego the step of needing to click create and just do it by automation? For example, when an op reaches a certain stage and just mirror the link. Also a fantastic question. So the short answer is yes. One of the main reasons that when we integrate Make into Monday, we like to use things like status columns for buttons. one of the big reasons for that is just as easily as I can click this manually, I can also set up an automation for this. Let's say, for example, we wanted as soon as our client is created within the client registry, we don't want to wait. We're just going to create the client folder right away. That would be as simple as combining it with a native Monday automation. In this case, it would be something along the lines of when an item is created, meaning that in this board client is created, we're going to change a status, the create client folder, to create. So that way we don't even have to do that manual step, and we can just mirror that link back to any relevant board. So Monday is for getting everything in Monday, and make is if I want to keep my regular cloud storage. I'm not entirely sure if I follow that question. Feel free to clarify that one a bit. All right, so let's see. I'll try to read that one again. So Monday is for getting everything in Monday, and make is if I want to keep. I think I follow your question. So it's if we compare to using, for example, the file column within Monday. Monday can also store files, but obviously a lot of times you want this shared file storage not only to be able to be accessible for non-Monday users, but also because we can be a bit more finicky with, for example, our access control. Oftentimes larger enterprises have things like user groups to give specific people access to specific files. Maybe they should still be able to find things within Monday, but they shouldn't be able to see very sensible data that is going to be stored in some form of file. For those cases, these type of integrations can be really helpful. But to also answer your question about keeping the regular cloud storage you're using today, essentially this integration that we created today is within Google Drive, but any of the big ones is going to be more or less the same thing, whether that be SharePoint or OneDrive or Dropbox. All of these services also have ready to go connectors with make.com. So the integration is going to be pretty much the same thing. Fantastic. All right, so finally, we had a look at the CRM version within Make. That is essentially because we assume that this is going to be one of the first things that happen within the client, the client journey, so the sales stage. This one creates a lot more for us because we know we're going to need those in the future. But let's have a look at the project one that we also in the example saw. We had some validation in terms of you have to select a type before you can create that, or if you try to create it, it's going to tell you that you need to select it. So jumping into the creation of project folder, initially it's going to look pretty much the same. We're going to have this receiver that is going to send the signal when you click that create folder button. It's going to retrieve some additional information. And then here we see that what's called a route again. We have two directions to go. And within that, we have filters to control which direction it should go. In this case, we're looking for if we haven't selected the size, we're going to change that create project folder to select type. So this is also to show you a Monday module. Again, a couple of pieces that we need to put it in so that it knows what to do. We're going to say within this board on this specific row, also called an item, in this column, I'm going to change that to select type only for the cases when we have not selected the type. And let's say if the type is selected, we're going to go the regular route. We're going to fetch some more information. We're going to get the client item. Reason being that now that we create the project folder, right, we want to make sure that that project folder is within the correct client folder. So we're going to fetch the client item. As we know, all of our client folder specific information is based on the client. And then we're going to create some project specific things. We're going to create the project folder. And then depending on if it's a medium or large project, or if it's a small, it's going to go one of these two routes and then copy the corresponding template documents into that newly created project folder. And then finally, as we had in the last one, of course, we're going to save the link to these created folders back into Monday. for some better visibility and navigation. Great. Do we have any more questions? All right. In that case, thank you everyone so much for attending today. This webinar will be available on demand later as well, so you can go back and tune into it again, so you can recap what we've talked about today. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Take care. Bye.